happened. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the New College of Florida Socratic stage. These events seek to advance civil discourse and engagement through facilitating events that foster open discussion and debate on relevant public policy issues. We are pleased to bring this event to you this evening with Mike Benz. Before we begin the main event, I would like to take a quick moment to thank our generous sponsors, Michael and Ling Markovitz, without whom this would not be possible. So if you could give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. All right, now, you may have been given a QR code to start a poll. We have established an affirmative position, a proposition for you to vote on. We will, after this presentation, ask you to vote again. To see if the presentation or the discussion has changed your thoughts on this. So the topic again is the government's role in the censorship industry. The affirmative proposition is the U.S. federal government has appropriately exercised its statutory authority with respect to free speech. All right, so please use your phones. I'm convinced. Please use your phones now to vote, and polling will be open for the next few minutes. At the end of the presentation, as I said, you can do it again. But while you're doing that, I'm going to read the introduction for Mike. Mike Benz is the Executive Director of Foundation for Freedom Online, a nonprofit watchdog dedicated to protecting digital liberties and restoring the free and open internet. During the Trump administration, Benz was in charge of the cyber portfolio of the U.S. State Department, where he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Communications and Information Technology. That role included formulating and negotiating U.S. policy on internet diplomacy issues, as well as interfacing with private industry and civil society in the big tech space. Prior to his State Department role, Benz served as a White House speechwriter for President Trump and advised on technology policy. Before his time in the public sector, Benz practiced business law as an attorney in New York, representing technology companies and financial firms. I am Dr. Dave Ellis. I'm an associate professor of international relations, political science here at New College of Florida. My own research background is democratization and development after identity conflict. How do you stitch societies back together again after they've been torn apart by identity conflict? That pathway actually had me move off into the Defense Intelligence Agency in 2009, where I became a human terrain analyst assigned to U.S. Special Operations Command. So I worked in the intelligence shop in a multi-intelligence pattern analysis section. I held top secret clearance in the SCIF. Later served as a program manager for a cyber intelligence contract with the Air Force, and then resumed my work at SOCOM as a resident senior fellow at the Joint Special Operations University. There I worked with the command, primarily the J5, or what's called the Strategy and Plans Directorate, out of SOCOM. And so there were conversations that I got to see as part of the global war on terror, as the capabilities were being constructed to fight the global war on terror. I had surmised certain activities that were going on, and when I heard Mike Benz speaking about some of the construction of the cyber capabilities in the U.S. government, they immediately resonated with some of my experiences. So I asked our events coordinator, Alex Islas, who did a fantastic job with all of our events this year. Yay, Alex. To see if we could have Mike with us tonight, and so graciously accepted, and we're happy to have you here. So we have Okay, well, I guess we're not going to probably change this too much, but
where are the 5%? I'm going to tailor my remarks to you.
So, Mike, let me pass it over to you to see if there's anything you wanted to say to get started tonight.
Well, I want to thank the New College of Florida for having me. Thank you, the incredible job that this institution is doing, I think, is inspiring to people well beyond academia, and so I'm very grateful. I also think that David's background is extremely fascinating. When we connected before this, and he was telling you he's telling me what he just told you, the pinball machine in my own brain lit up, because I think to people who are on the civilian side, when they hear about a military or intelligence background, they think, okay, that's military and intelligence stuff. That doesn't really impact me as a civilian. That's them going out, that's them maybe shaping an information environment abroad, but in a worldwide web, in an interconnected system, where our diplomacy and civil military work actually involves shaping civilian affairs, if you deem a particular political movement or ideology giving rise to a government that might impact the State Department's national interest agenda or the Defense Department's national security agenda, suddenly media becomes the domain of the military. And you find yourself quickly enmeshed in a web where you want to say something about public health, or you want to say something about elections, and you're caught up in a dragnet of something so many levels above what you're used to dealing with as a civilian, because these new developments that we're going to be talking about tonight really collapse that distinction that we've always had between the civilian and the military realms.
Thank you. To frame a little bit of the impact of this conversation, I offer you this passage from Anthony Giddens from a book he wrote, a very famous sociologist, from a book in 1991, I believe, called The Consequences of Modernity. The nature of modern institutions is deeply bound up with the mechanisms of trust in abstract systems, especially trust in expert systems. The reliance placed on lay actors, you and I, upon expert systems is not just a matter of generating a sense of security about an independently given universe of events, meaning that they just exist. It is a matter of the calculation of benefit and risk in certain circumstances where expert knowledge does not just provide that calculus, but actually creates or reproduces the universe of events as a result of the very continual reflexive implementation of that very knowledge. Mike, I wanted to open up with that just to see if you had a reaction given the context of the work you've been doing.
Well, I love this passage because it lights up a kind of treasure map of all these censor speak words. I started creating a sort of lexicon of censor speak to try to decode this for people so that when they see these recurring keywords in an otherwise innocuous looking document, they can actually x-ray through to understand it. And in the first iteration of that sort of censor speak lexicon code base, the words institutions and trust were two of those first 10 words. And what immediately comes to mind is, as true as that statement may be, it has a very pernicious enforcement arm when you try to enforce that using the government. So we have about a dozen U.S. government programs that explicitly have the word trust in them, and to restore trust in institutions. And each of these have a sort of technical meaning. So in State Department parlance, institution effectively means asset. When we capacity build institutions in a foreign country, when USAID provides financial capital, when the State Department provides coordinating advice, when the Defense Department provides some technical tool for them for that institution to do its work. Those institutions, that's not a charity. We're not giving that to that group because we independently like that institution. It has to be justified as being in the U.S. national interest. So institution is sort of a shorthand for asset. We build up institutions. And the word trust, this is right at the center of what all these censorship programs do. For example, there's the Secure Trust in Cyberspace program at the National Science Foundation. There is the Trust and Authenticity Track F program at the Convergence Accelerator at NSF. Both of these programs, it's about $80 million of U.S. taxpayer money. In the charter documents for the program, which were each created in 2021, It says that democracy is in crisis because trust has been undermined in our institutions. What do the charter documents for those programs and about 60 U.S. university programs have as stock language? It's that institution is defined as the government, the science, and the news media. Those are the definitions of the institution. So when you read this paragraph through the lens of censorspeak, when this is used in a U.S. government media literacy program or information integrity program or countering disinformation program or digital resilience program, what they are saying is that if you disagree with the New York Times, you're attacking democracy, and the white blood cells of the immune system of the government will pay a web of NGOs and private sector firms to censor your ability to undermine public trust in what the New York Times said, because they are a news media institution, or in what the NIH says, because it is a medical research institution, or what the US government is doing, because government agencies are institutions. And so while there may be a kernel of truth in this, actually, if I can just say one more thing on this. There's a fantastic document that was produced just 1 month into Biden's presidency. It was in February 2021. It was the USAID Disinformation Primer. This is at a time when USAID was formalizing all the different soft power projection arms of institutions dedicated to censoring the internet to stop a movement from rising to power in a country that was of interest to the State Department. And one of the things in this primer, and they built a whole bureau around it, it's called the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, and it is a whole bureau within that around disinformation. And what they said is that the rise of popularity of populist ideas and accounts on social media is hurting USAID programming, because we are funding institutions in those countries, and these populist groups in those countries are undermining trust in those institutions. And so we need to censor those populist accounts, whether that is in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Germany, Brazil, Kenya, Eritrea, Pakistan. We need a State Department emissary, we need a USAID delegation, we need an NGO swarm, because their disagreement with our capacity-built institutions is hurting our programming. And then they go on to say in that document that the goal is to eliminate the capability for a populist expertise, a subject matter expertise developed through peer-to-peer communications when people are allowed a free and unfettered internet that gives them essentially an alternate hub of authority, that they sort of become institutions in and of themselves, social media influencers or populist political parties. And so it's literally to not just to preserve trust in government-sponsored institutions, but to block the ability to actually have trust in something that you might organically prefer.
That's fantastic as an opening statement. I appreciate that. For context, the reason I asked that question was because I'm hoping that this conversation will strike at what we call the bottom of the iceberg. Normally, we see all kinds of debate and rancor in the public, in the media, because we're just focusing above the waterline. We're dealing with symptoms. We're not really dealing with the bottom of the iceberg, which is the mental models. What are the basic assumptions we're bringing to the conversation? And my hope tonight is that we can explore that bottom side. What are the mental models of legitimate concern? What are the areas where there might be a clash between you and others? What is that difference of opinion? And the outcome of that is, well, you build structures, governments, policies, and such that are built upon those different mental models. So if we're successful tonight, we'll have a better sense of the different mental models at play that lead to different preferences, if that makes sense.
Totally.
So, all right, so let's start with some definitions since we have our affirmative. Tell us how you interpret the word censorship. So what does that mean to you?
So I would use the definition of that's widely used by people involved in disinformation studies from the censorship side of things, which is remove, reduce, inform. That is the general three-part rubric for the levels of reduction of prevalence of First Amendment, otherwise First Amendment protected speech. So starting at the top is remove. That's when something is banned. That's sort of the most obvious example of censorship. You have an account on social media, it gets banned. You make a post, it gets deleted. You upload a video on YouTube, it's deemed to be against the terms of service for some speech code. So that's sort of the big one up top. The bottom one is inform, which is the lightest touch, and that is essentially when there is a deliberate attempt by people not involved in the peer-to-peer communication of posting and reading a post, but people on the outside who do not want that idea to spread or don't want people to see that post and believe it. And so under the rubric of inform, this is the universe of fact checkers. For example, I think everyone who's had the experience of YouTube in the past 5-6 years has seen a video about whatever topic you're looking at, and there will often be a sort of a direct Wikipedia top line where it will say, you were talking about climate change. Climate change is a man-made phenomenon, blah, 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 blah. And it will sort of give you the official story of what you're supposed to believe with a permanent interstitial, an in-between, to get between you and the message. And that's sort of the lightest form, because that's still designed to reduce the virality and rig the information ecosystem. A lot of the magic, though, most of it happens in the world of reduce, and that's that middle layer. Reduce, they used to call this deboosting, algorithmic demotion, but that was a little bit too explicit, and lawmakers and policymakers, their ears started to perk up when they heard things like downranking. So they've now switched that whole universe of reduce to a word that they call intervention. This is the toolkit of interventions that can be run on a post or an account to censor it into oblivion while stopping the so-called martyr effect of you noticing that it's been censored. And so intervention is this cute word that basically makes it sound like they're saving you from yourself, like you're drunk or something. They're running an intervention. And the toolkits of interventions are many. So folks may be familiar with concepts like shadow banning, when you can see a post but others can't. Search recommendation bans, where your name does not complete in search. Recommendation bans, all sorts of advertiser and monetization throttling. Virality circuit breakers that apply to your account or to a particular narrative, so that after a certain quotient of people see it, it basically creates a artificial ceiling for that post-virality. And this was something that, so all of these things I consider to be the definition of censorship. If I can just say one thing to flesh this out, which I think is really interesting, because when all this got started in the beginning, in 2016, 2017, 2018, these heavy-handed, high-profile censorship incidents were causing political blowback, and people began to ask questions about why it was, for example, Alex Jones, who's a controversial, talk radio host, when he got banned, it caused a sort of Barbara Streisand effect, a martyr effect, and millions of dollars began to flow from the Pentagon and the National Science Foundation into how to stop the martyr effect when you censor someone and other people notice they're censored. And so there's a tremendous mathematical science that has been poured into exactly when virality circuit breakers should be applied, at what level to apply the censorship. Sometimes if they want to take out an influencer, what they'll do instead of top down is they will do bottom up. They'll create a network grid of all the accounts who amplify that person, and they will, to censor that person, they will censor 4 of his top 6 lieutenants, or they will do a random partial 35% reduction in the base of amplifiers. So, it's a lot, but anything that artificially reduces the spread on speech-based grounds or political speech-based grounds, I would define as censorship.
So does this graphic help explain a little bit what you just described? This might be the natural affinity for a particular person. There's a concern about what is being stated, so you could start to hit on the margins, break up some of the linkages. But if you go after key nodes or key hubs in the system, then people are inoculated from the message. Is that?
That's exactly right. This is the starting task of basically every government-funded censorship operation. This is network theory in action. This is links and nodes. What you do is you create, they call it a topographical network map or a narrative network map. And this is why so many censorship programs are folded at US universities under their computer science, their data science, their computational sciences, even their applied physics labs or centers or institutes, because of the first pass job of ingesting all the different tweets in a particular narrative. Say you want to censor someone's opposition to the government's lockdown measures with respect to COVID. So what they would do is the first step is you ingest 1 billion tweets off Twitter. You download the transcript, ingesting hundreds of thousands of YouTube videos, tens of millions of Facebook posts. You map everything by keyword. First, you have these computer scientists who ultimately create this machine learning model that generates a map that looks like that. And then on the other side, you have the social scientists. These are the people in sociology, communications, political science, any number of ones, psychology, sociology. And they will create a code book of words that you use to describe a topic. So for example, if you are opposed to certain US war interventions in a foreign country, they will create keyword maps of all the different slogans and all the different trending news items that have taken on a life of their own, and then they will create a map of all the accounts that have amplified that information or that narrative. They will then run effectively a sort of they'll do a sort of sentiment analysis about whether or not these accounts are pro or against on the basis of these sort of proximal words, and it will spit out a graph that looks like this that they can then play with in terms of the interventions that they run on the virality of that narrative. But that's for everything. This graph is now everything from COVID to energy policy to elections to foreign wars. This is chapter 1, really, of the story.
So what hard breaks are there between the intelligence, you had foreshadowed this part of the conversation, what are the hard breaks between the intelligence community and the domestic investigation? So could you explain for the audience, what are the responsibilities of professionals in the intelligence community, and then where does that stop once it gets to the US borders?
Well, the intelligence community operates under so it's got 2 wings to it. There's the analyst track, which is the collection of evidence and the analysis of it. So, for example, CIA analysts will produce memos, and those memos will be read by people at the State Department or people on the National Security Council, so that the collected intelligence you can have a functional brain to interpret it through the lens of an expert analyst. The other track is operations, and that's sort of where the dirty work comes in. That is the role of the intelligence community in operations operates under the cloak of plausible deniability, which is when the State Department or the Pentagon wants to do something, but it would be too controversial or there would be diplomatic blowback, and so it can't get caught doing it, and so it's handed off to the operations wing to get the thing done without making look like it was done in a directed fashion from the US government. And so that's a pretty nasty beast. That was the brainchild of George Kennan, who was one of the most celebrated State Department diplomats in US history. After he created this plausible deniability doctrine in 1948, a decade later, he would announce it was the greatest mistake of his life, but we live with this today. And you can argue that it's a necessary thing. It is a mean old world out there. If we don't do it, somebody else will. There is this shadow game that's played. And so you can argue that it does have a robust and potentially necessary role in statecraft. But the social contract that was made when our intelligence state was set up is that it was always supposed to be facing outward. It was a sort of pit bull. It was to defend the home against hostile foreign threats abroad, or to do maybe nasty things that just had to be done on the world stage, but it was supposed to be for the benefit of American citizens. It was never supposed to be, the pit bull was never supposed to come inside the house, so to speak. But as our intelligence arms and our statecraft arms have increasingly merged, in particular through the shared NGO-plex that functions both as a capacity for the State Department and as a directed weapon for intelligence to actually operate, you have these doctrinal shifts that have happened that have effectively unleashed the CIA and other equities within our intelligence sphere, including our homegrown ones, like FBI is the intelligence arm of the Justice Department. DHS is something called INA, which is the only other non-FBI domestic equity in our whole 17 intelligence agencies. But what's happened is during the Cold War, our intelligence capacities were directed at toppling communist governments abroad. And this was justified in part through the Wilsonian edict to make the world safe for democracy, and these left-wing autocracies under communism were said to be subjugating their people, so we were liberating these countries by sicking our intelligence apparatus on toppling their governments. And then you had the GWAT era, where we went sort of from counter-communism to counter-terrorism. But then in 2016, all of those capacities shifted to counter-populism. And this was really the first time conservatives have ever had to really feel the brunt of the intelligence state directed inward. Because in the 1960s and 70s, the Democrats and progressives were facing then what many conservatives are facing now. There was CIA interference in the domestic, internecine civil war in the Democrat Party. You had a sort of limousine liberal internationalist class who was interventionalist in foreign wars, and then you had another faction within the Democrat Party who was Vietnam War protesters, identified with the Third World People's Movement, and believed that NATO was subjugating other countries around the world. And so the first disclosures that we ever really got about the intelligence community, they were completely unfettered for their first 30 years. There was no Senate Intelligence Committee. There was no House Intelligence Committee until the Church Committee hearings of 1975 and 1976. And in those hearings were the result of the CIA interfering in Democrat Party domestic politics, funding the National Students Association, essentially bribing student organizations on college campuses in order to wedge out the element of the Democrat Party that was deemed hostile to the Pentagon agenda and to the intelligence state. But you could still make the argument at the end of the day there that was about a sort of, the communist socialist threat of usurping individual liberty it can be expanded to mean something totalizing, but in large part it's fairly narrow when you see it. Populism is literally anything opposed to a government or institutional consensus. I mean, populism is the redress for people when their institutions fail them. If populism is defined as an attack on democracy, and our democracy promotion toolkit at CIA is deployed to stop that, then you no longer have democracy. You no longer have individuals being able to vote themselves out of institutional failure or vote to reform those institutions, because the system itself is blocking people from talking or generating political support for an elected government that could implement those changes. So the expansion into counter-populism has completely dissolved the distinction between intelligence work and simple political opposition work, except now it's being done with the long arm of the state and the cloak and dagger capacities that only our intelligence agencies have.
Now, you've talked about public-private partnerships a lot, and could you describe what you mean by that, and how does that fit into what you might describe as the censorship industrial complex?
Well, public-private partnerships, generally people think of those in the economic realm, where you have, there's a certain libertarian Milton Friedman tenet that is, quite popular in economics, and that sort of forms the foundation for our edict that a corporation exists to maximize total shareholder value. It's sort of this idea that a private company has inherent efficiencies over a public entity in terms of getting things done because it is accountable to the market. If a private company doesn't do something well, then an alternative competitor will. So as long as antitrust is enforced, as long as you have a competitive environment, a public firm will always do something cheaper and better than a public agency. And so you have these frequent public-private partnerships in everything from regional development to the defense space or to telecom with satellite communications. There's a frequent interplay between the public and the private where the public puts up the money, but the private sector has a sort of incentive to build it and can reap part of the profits. And so it's supposed to be sort of symbiotic. Now, a lot of people define that as the definition of fascism, this sort of merger of public and private, and I'll leave that aside because where this enters the censorship story is this public-private partnership model forms the basis for the laundering that is done to circumvent the First Amendment. The government knows that it is not allowed to just simply command the private sector not to engage in First Amendment protected speech. That is the bedrock of our Constitution. And as this apparatus, this censorship industry was being constructed in 2016, there was a lot of tender love and care that poured into the structuring of how the government, the private sector, civil society organizations, and allied media entities would all form a so-called whole of society counter-misinformation network to pull this off. And what they said at the time is, China and Russia don't have this problem where populist insurgencies can radically alter the direction of a 30-year plan that the CCP has put in place for economic development or foreign treaties or foreign policy. Russia does not have this problem. They can simply crack down using the power of the state on the political speech that gives rise to populism. And they said the problem is our entire diplomatic toolkit is arranged around this Wilsonian edict of democracy versus autocracy. This is what allows us to enter other countries and overturn their governments, and we call that a humanitarian intervention. It's because we are bringing democracy, we're liberating the people from their own government. So what they did is they said, okay, well, we can't do it all top down, so we need to create a whole of society. We need to have, the government's role is going to be to astroturf and capacity build these private sector entities. And private sector is on the for-profit side, and civil society is where you get this web of NGOs and universities. But this was designed to both circumvent the First Amendment, because if the government is paying NGOs to pressure the tech companies to implement a censorship thing, and the NGOs function as a sort of emissary. The NGOs, as part of those conversations, will identify that they've got support in Congress. They will point out the regulatory vulnerabilities that they have, and the NGOs will also work to create an advertiser crisis. They will work with the media organizations to essentially put what they call a media escalation, to have the trust and safety teams at the tech companies get so panicked that they escalate the censorship demand to the senior leadership because of the fear that if the New York Times calls them a host for virulent mis and disinformation, while other tech companies have implemented the censorship measure, that tech company will be singled out for an advertiser boycott. This is sort of the evolution of Mark Zuckerberg, by the way. Mark Zuckerberg had resisted censorship in 2019 and said it had gone too far, but then an advertiser boycott campaign called #ChangeTheTerms cost Zuckerberg $60 billion in market cap in 2 weeks. And so he essentially relented and gave up what the U.S. Global Engagement Center at the State Department had been wanting them to implement in terms of hate speech provisions that blocked the ability for people both in the U.S. and Europe to mobilize around opposition to open borders. And so this plays itself out in every facet. I mentioned this USAID primer in February 2021. That's a 97-page document. 31 times in this US government agency blueprint for how to censor the internet, every third page was a plea to make sure advertisers are included in the whole of society network so that advertising revenue can capacity cripple any tech company or any tech servicer or anyone upstream or downstream on the distribution chain would have their business model devastated if they went against the government policy, the preferred government policy or public support for it. So you have USAID working with hundreds of NGOs, dozens of pop-up for-profit censorship mercenary firms. These are groups like NewsGuard and Global Disinformation Index. NewsGuard is a for-profit private sector firm whose job is to create a censorship blacklist that it then sells as a part of its business model to tech companies and even now to foreign governments so that they can automatically implement this censorship blacklist in their algorithms for filtering and feeding information in feeds. Before they even launched their first commercial product in 2018, they announced that the purpose of this was to deprive alternative news accounts of advertising income, okay? So they create news nutrition labels, like on a milk carton, but about how fake news something is. But this was not designed primarily to just provide the public an independent, nonpartisan read on whether or not the news source is good or bad or trustworthy or not. It's a for-profit mechanism where this company is profiting from a blueprint they announced before they even launched their commercial product, that the whole purpose of it is to crush the advertising revenue of alternative news that resulted in Trump's election in 2016. They respond right after the 2016 election. Now, who's on the board of NewsGuard, a private sector censorship mercenary firm? Well, it's General Michael V. Hayden. You might know that name, former head of the CIA, former head of the NSA, and a former four-star general. Rick Stengel, the founder of the State Department's Global Engagement Center, which was the State Department first ever censorship bureau. Tom Ridge, the former head of DHS. Oh, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former head of NATO during the Obama administration. So on the board of this US government-funded, they got a $750,000 Pentagon contract, and they're wrapped up in these disinformation task forces. They're also partnering with the European Union to help NATO censor NATO-skeptical EU political movements. But so on the board of this independent, for-profit, private sector firm is the head of the CIA, the head of the NSA, a four-star general, the head of DHS, the head of the State Department censorship arm, and the head of all of NATO. And they're the ones who are effectively producing censorship blacklists for all of the social media companies to implement in order to stop mom and pop media shops from being able to make money, or alternative news institutions like Breitbart or OAN or Prager University or Newsmax, or even some left-wing populist groups who are against the military-industrial complex from the sort of more left-wing side, in order to make sure they can't compete in the information environment with preferred puppets, the institutions in the news media that serve as effectively the PR wing to sell government policy on an unsuspecting public.
I may be taking this down a rabbit hole, but I have got to ask you about the Global Engagement Center, because in 2018, 2019, 2020, working with folks, military information support operations, psychological operations, basically, influence operations, we had a very low regard for the GEC.
Yeah.
We could not actually see it doing anything overseas in any meaningful capacity. What was going on at that time, 2018, 2019, 2020, that justified its existence? What did it think it was supposed to be doing? If you could, I would love to know.
Well, it's a fascinating time period for GEC because it was very much in transition then. So the Global Engagement Center out of the State Department, the term global engagement comes from this concept in a government agency of external stakeholder engagement. That's the code word in whether that's DHS or FBI or state or DOD. External stakeholder engagement means when someone from the government agency goes into the private sector or goes into the civil society space, engages with the outside parties to get them on board so that they are folded into the network supporting the government policy. And that will often involve, sometimes those are easy conversations when there's a natural ally. Let's just say you want to topple the government of a country that sits on a lot of oil. Your external stakeholder engagement with ExxonMobil is probably going to be pretty easy. If you are doing that in something where you have a long-standing relationship with certain stakeholders, but they oppose the government policy, there may need to be favors for favors. This is when things get kicked into the interagency, and maybe they need regulatory, maybe they need their FTC, approvals, greenlit by the Obama administration. If you're Google in that case, when Google was forming effectively a shadow State Department for Hillary Clinton. But the Global Engagement Center was started in basically between 2014 and 2016. Technically, they say 2014. That was, at the time, it was a nasty job that it was set up to do, which was to censor the internet pretty explicitly. But it was for something that was hard to argue against. Telling this story used to be a little different until about a week ago, well, actually until about 48 hours ago, when suddenly a Syrian war has popped off again, and now this is all no longer ancient history. But if folks can look back about a decade, you may recall that the Obama administration wanted to put military boots on the ground in Syria. ISIS had not been eradicated at that point. I'll asterisk that, but so ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. There was a high-level plan in place to put military boots on the ground in Syria. And so the threat of homegrown ISIS attacks was everywhere in the news in 2014, 2015. There were a series of domestic terror attacks. There were terror attacks in France. The first one of these in February 2015, there was the Garland, Texas attack, which turned out 3 years later, the FBI had actually paid someone over $100,000 to become that ISIS shooter's best friend and was texting that person to tear up Texas. The FBI actually tailgated the person before he shot 2 people in Texas, but didn't disclose that to defense counsel during the attempted murder trial, and it only came out because of leaks from the FBI field office in Arizona. But nevertheless, it was used as the battering ram for political support for GEC, because there was this idea that ISIS videos, ISIS propaganda videos, were spreading all over social media. By the way, you want to go through a really funny exercise. Everyone can take out their phones right now, go to google.com and type in ISIS propaganda videos, Pentagon $500 million, and you will find a Pentagon grant. Actually, the Pentagon spent $500 million actually producing ISIS propaganda videos. They paid Bell Pottinger, a British PR firm, to create many of the ISIS propaganda videos that the Global Engagement Center was set up to stop the spread of. So, riddle me that in terms of, but okay. Getting back to this. So everyone hated ISIS. ISIS was beheading people. It was very gory. It was very gruesome. Nobody wanted their son or daughter to become recruited by the seductive call of the caliphate. And so the Global Engagement Center was set up so that the State Department would have a permanent and powerful back channel with the tech companies to tell them what ISIS accounts to censor. And part of this was in the name of national security, but a lot of this was just simply in the name of statecraft. We wanted to eliminate Islamic extremism. And so the State Department is a natural place to put that, because under the banner of a State Department office, you can do a lot of dirty things that go well beyond the State Department. The State Department only has a $35 billion budget. It's actually not one of the largest agencies by funding. It gets its power not because it's the best piano player in the band or the best violinist, but because it's the orchestra conductor of all the different soft power assets and institutions that answer to it because it sets foreign policy. So, for example, the CIA was effectively created, if anyone wants to read the Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare by George Kennan, which was the document right before the plausible deniability doctrine was established. The whole purpose of the CIA plausible deniability doctrine was because the State Department couldn't get caught doing, but as long as the State Department had effective control, because the CIA answered to the assistant secretary or answered to the undersecretary or secretary, the CIA is folded effectively under the State Department on all things national interest. It's effectively folded under the Pentagon or through the National Security Council when it comes to military work that the CIA does. But the State Department is often cover for CIA work. The State Department is often cover for USAID work or for U.S. Agency for Global Media work, which is essentially the worldwide octopus of media organizations that answer to the U.S. government. We call them independent media, but we fund them and direct them, so make of that what you will. But so by putting it at the State Department, you have the whole panoply of options in terms of how to coerce those social media companies. And at the time, they didn't need much coercion because it was an easy sell. Then Rick Stengel, who was the founder of the Global Engagement Center, he had come from Time magazine. He was the managing editor. Time magazine was the sort of flagship enterprise, I should note, of Operation Mockingbird, the major CIA media operation from the 1950s to the 1970s. This all came out in 1975. Make of that again what you will. But so Rick Stengel described himself as a free speech maximalist when he was the managing editor of Time magazine. He described his role at State as the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy to export the First Amendment around the world. And he created this Global Engagement Center set up to give the State Department a back channel to censor ISIS content. And then a funny thing happened on the way to Trump's inauguration. Trump won the 2016 election. Rick Stengel quickly wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post and then a full book on how actually we need to rescind the First Amendment because actually the First Amendment allows people like Trump to get elected. And so everything I just said for the past 50 years of my life, scrub that from the record. We're starting again clean. We need to kill the Constitution. So, but the Global Engagement Center remained institutionally. It was quickly apportioned $120 million that were earmarked initially for the Pentagon to stop Russian propaganda. This was, the CIA made this proclamation in December 2016 that Trump had sort of only won the 2016 election because of social media interference from Russia. This is before the bots and trolls. They were saying, well, RT and Sputnik were having this outsized influence. And so they, under the banner of fighting Russian disinformation, GEC was reinvigorated because very quickly ISIS died. ISIS
it's a
died.
zombie. It comes back every now and again. So.
Yes.
It's coming back again, everybody.
So, so Trump eliminated the caliphate effectively within 3 months. So, in theory, GEC should have been shut down, but it got a second lease on life by moving from counterterrorism to counterpopulism. And what they argued is, well, the State Department does great power competition. We use our economic and diplomatic toolkit to do essentially, great power competition with China, with Russia, with Iran, with Venezuela. And so this is simply great power competition in the information space. And there's this ongoing FBI special prosecutor probe. Trump may be a Russian asset for all we know. And so GEC was revitalized, no longer focused on ISIS, but focused on Russian propaganda, while everyone at GEC was in that Rick Stengel political ideology that Trump's mere existence and ability to, warm the seat of the Oval Office was an existential threat to the rules-based order. And so GEC became this institution devoted to censoring all, a funny situation, because it was a Trump State Department office whose raison d'etre was to censor Trump supporters, and Trump allies, both domestically and internationally. And they did this by saying, we outsource to the NGO sphere, Gongo sphere, government organized, government funded, non-governmental organizations, again, riddle me that, and then these private sector firms who will make independent third-party expert determinations about whether something is Russian disinformation. And so all of these third-party firms paid for by the State Department came back with lists of accounts for the Global Engagement Center to flag as Russian disinformation. 100% of these accounts were Trump supporters at home or Trump allies internationally through movements in Italy and Germany and Spain and France and Brazil. And so, I mean, it got ridiculous at a certain point. They started naming real-world celebrities, like I believe Adam Baldwin was in the State Department Global Engagement Center list of fake Russian accounts. But because nobody was checking the math on this and everyone just assumed, they just trusted the CIA that this Russian propaganda thing really tilted the 2016 election, they had carte blanche to use the State Department's imprimatur to pressure the social media companies to censor those accounts. And the social media companies did not want to fight back against that because they were dependent on that same State Department to save them from foreign governments who were threatening their business models, like the EU Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. I got a personal phone call from 9 Google lobbyists one day where they told me the State Department has to take a certain diplomatic posture against Europe because these laws were the #1 existential threat to Google's business model. Well, in that climate, Google's going to do anything the global engagement partner says because they're right down the office. They want favors from cyber to pressure, you're basically tamping down the EU Digital Markets Act. So they're going to give the other wing of the State Department whatever they want on censoring Russian propaganda accounts, and they're not going to do the technical forensics into hundreds of pages of databases about whether every account there is really a troll. But this came home, there was only so far the State Department could push it from 2018 to 2019 while it was confined there. In the origins of how it really came home domestically, this DHS center called the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, which is a name that puts you half to sleep before you're finished saying it. This was the real Ministry of Truth. They just, at that time in 2019 when they set it up, did not have the boldness to call it the Disinformation Governance Board. They only got in trouble once they halfway announced what they were really doing, but they were already there for 3 years. And they were set up because the State Department and NATO and the intelligence services thought that GEC was not powerful enough to stop the threat of Trump at home. So the origins of this DHS pure domestic facing, because State Department's only supposed to face outward. The only time the State Department or the CIA can target US citizens is under what they call a counterintelligence predicate, which is when, the NSA is not allowed to read Tucker Carlson's signal messages. The NSA is a military agency that's supposed to look outward. Why were they reading Tucker's signal chats when he tried to arrange an interview with Vladimir Putin? Well, it's because we have a cute little get-out-of-Constitution-free card called counterintelligence, which is we're not allowed to do intelligence work on US citizens because it's a Department of Dirty Tricks and it faces outward. But if we slip the word counter in front of it, then we're spying on you as US citizens because we think you might be being spied on or manipulated by or part of a formal or informal network with another spy agency. So if you do a Twitter post that, say, vociferously opposes aid to a certain foreign country where we need that aid to capacity build military or intelligence assets in order to maintain a presence there or to win a war there, well, why are you doing that? Are you doing that because Russia wants you to do it? Are you doing it because China wants you to do it? We need a counterintelligence investigation on this person. And boom, just like that, the full powers of the CIA and the NSA can be directed on you as a US citizen just to make sure that another foreign country is not using you. But that's the trick of how this all got started before they just shifted into a democracy predicate to say that misinformation is a threat to democracy, and that's how it scaled through the NGO sphere. But just to bring this all back, so the Atlantic Council is one of the big prime movers in this space. They have 7 former #1 heads of the CIA currently on their board of directors. I say this a lot, but it's worth repeating. A lot of people don't know that 7 #1 former heads of the CIA are still alive, let alone all alive and locally and clustered locally on the board of directors of the very institution that effectively set this whole thing up. Now, the Atlantic Council is essentially the civilian, kind of semi-clandestine, it's public-facing, but they essentially are the civil military connective tissue for NATO. They build themselves as NATO's think tank. And so when something needs to be done at the civilian level of a government, at the journalism level, to implement a NATO policy, if NATO says, hey, you know what, it's 2003, 2004, NATO partners are not voting in their parliaments to get increased military aid or to join the coalition of the willing to invade Afghanistan or Iraq, well, we need to improve the civilian political climate, and so NATO effectively seeks the Atlantic Council to nudge those countries' civilian politics. It's, again, this creep between the military and the civilian class. When the military is supposed to answer to the civilians, that's what a civilian-run government is supposed to have. That's supposed to that distinguishes us from a military junta, but that's now all been sort of inverted. But what the Atlantic Council did in 2018, right on the eve of CISA's creation, is they said, GEC is not going far enough. They were identifying effectively what you were. They're not all that effective. ISIS is dead. The only other thing that they're tasked with doing right now is stopping Russian propaganda. They can only push that so far before the Trump administration wakes up from its coma and realizes hey, that means us, the White House. They only had a limited amount of capital to play with because they got essentially this $120 million allocation. There was some infighting. So the Atlantic Council published this memo that as part of their forward defense program in 2018 that snowballed into the creation of this DHS, Domestic Censorship Agency. Forward defense is a very cute term, by the way. It's not offense. We're not attacking you. We're simply defending ourselves in a highly forward position. But what they argued is we need a domestic disinformation capacity. And they lay out a sort of how this could be structured. And they start by saying, well, we already have GEC at state. And that we already have the human capital there who would be willing to carry this out. And they've been effective in some respects, but the problem is the State Department's foreign-facing. And in the next paragraph, they say, well, this is really intelligence work. And so this is something we'd normally task the CIA with doing, because the CIA has a license, a broad license abroad, to shake down foreign media organizations and tell them to print or not print a story, in order to influence them, to do favors or favors, so that media will shift. I mean, a third of the CIA's budget at one point went just to funding and bribes and extortionists, effectively media outlets, in order to swing hearts and minds. As part of our soft power diplomatic work, we swing the hearts and minds of a country so that they support a government we want them to support, oppose one we want them to oppose, support a bill that we want to get passed in that country, support a military base, you name it. So it's really an intelligence capacity. The problem is the CIA is not allowed to do this at home. And also, this really can't be structured as an intelligence operation because the whole society framework involves tens of thousands of different people across hundreds of NGOs and for-profit companies and rank and file and media organizations. They can't all have security clearances. So what else are we left with? Well, we've got the FBI. The FBI, and this is the third paragraph. I'm now just listing, everyone can look up the Forward Defense Atlantic Council, I think it was October 2018. Michael Chertoff et al., they had a whole launch party when they released this with 3 former DHS heads endorsing it, and all the Michael V. Hayden CIA network folks all saying this is a great idea, we should do this. But so they said, okay, states ruled out, CIA's ruled out. Then they said FBI would be great for this because FBI is domestic facing and FBI is an intelligence organization. So they can do this and it can be sort of, hush hush, not everybody has to know about it. We can, throw a big classified blanket over this stuff. But then they said, the problem is the FBI is technically not a standalone institution. It's the intelligence arm of the Justice Department. The FBI can only deploy federal resources when there's a suspected act of lawbreaking. And it is not against the law to tweet your support for Donald Trump or to tweet that you have a problem with mail-in ballots. You think they might not be safe and secure in the run to the 2020 election when they were pre-censoring all this. So they said, well, what does that leave with us with? Well, the only other agency that could do this is DHS. DHS is the only other domestic intelligence that we have 17 intelligence agencies. Only 2 of them are domestic, the other 15 are foreign-facing. The two domestic ones are FBI and DHS. They said, so DHS can, and the nice thing about DHS is, unlike the FBI, they are a free-floating organization. They do not need suspected law-breaking to deploy federal resources. So we can create a censorship agency within DHS that has carte blanche to take out any mis- or disinformation that we flag online, and no one can argue with it constitutionally because they're not subject to the Justice Department, and all we need to do is argue that these tweets that occur in the cyber realm are effectively a cybersecurity attack on the critical infrastructure of our elections or on our public health institutions. And so they took a cybersecurity capacity, which people normally think means hacking. They grafted a whole academic jargon around it, so where, in the cyber realm, there's a concept of a kill chain, a sort of hacking kill chain of all the different links in the chain of how it's all carried out. And so they said, well, there's a disinformation kill chain. And then they said, okay, well, tweets on the internet and Facebook posts and YouTube videos are a misinformation when it undermines public trust in institutions, is a cyber attack in the form of misinformation on the critical infrastructure of public trust in our elections, public trust in our institutions, public trust in the news media. And so DHS got this long-arm jurisdiction to censor any tweet anywhere, effectively under this completely unfettered capacity that they were given. And just one final thing to bring this all home, there was an amazing sort of football end zone touchdown dance conference that DHS did at one of their cybersecurity conferences on disinformation in 2021, where one of the presenters says that what we did at DHS is we basically took the intelligence capacity that the CIA has, and we took effectively the domestic jurisdiction of the FBI, and we effectively created a kind of domestic CIA. And it was really creative of us. That was a really cool idea. It's like we completely end-ran the First Amendment. We completely end-ran the criminal justice system. We completely end-ran all the restrictions on the intelligence community to be able to censor tweets. We should scale this to everything. And at that time in 2021, that was the direction things were headed. After they pulled off the mail-in ballot mass censorship in 2020 to rig the information ecosystem against Trump and Trump supporters, after they pulled off the COVID-19 censorship, they, at DHS, in their own internal memos, were scaling this to opposition to the war in Ukraine. If you oppose Ukraine war funding, and I'm not weighing in on that, but you're a free citizen and you're allowed to tweet about that. But that was being folded into a cybersecurity attack on the democratic institutions of our military, or your opinions on climate change. At one point, they even put irregular migration in there and said that if you effectively tweet opposition to open borders, that you were effectively catcalling the cartels in Mexico about how open the border was. And so now this misinformation about the open border is now a DHS concern. They need to censor your ability to talk about the open border because that might make more people come through the open border because they think it's open. So even that got folded into it. So that's really how that foreign and domestic meshing was set up in the first place.
The story that you just told, I saw that from a different angle. And so as I had mentioned, I'd become a contractor in 2013, left government service and became a contractor. By 2015, 2016, I was a program manager for the cyber intelligence contract, so we started looking around for new contracts. And I started seeing the capabilities that were used, manhunting and other network capabilities that we just described, for the global war on terror being issued out of the Department of Homeland Security. And that's when I started to get actually very concerned. Because there is a certain skill set and a certain mindset to manhunting and network busting that doesn't translate very well in the law enforcement milieu. So it winds up, where did they find the people that started to lead these agencies? What's their profile and what's the mental models that they're bringing to these new cyber infrastructure security agency and such?
They were probably a lot of your old friends. In large part, they came from counterintelligence. You know, I'm sorry, counterinsurgency. I'm sorry, that's,
Yep.
So, you know, we have this, you know, everyone's sort of familiar with the war on terrorism and the concept of counterterrorism, and there's never any gray zone about that, we think. You know, someone's blown up, you know, civilians, and so they're terrorists, and if they're terrorists, you know, you can drone strike them, you can whatever, because it's terrorists, right? But we have a layer that's softer than that, where we sort of jam these phrases together. Counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. You know, the backslash does a lot of work there, because it gets you out of terrorism. Insurgency is this concept that a political movement or an extremist movement is rising to power in a country. It is an insurgent force that is opposing the in-power government that's being supported by the US government, being supported by the US military, being supported by the US State Department. And so even if they are not necessarily involved in kinetic terrorist acts, we can slap in a sort of insurgency label on them and engage in all of the special operations and Department of Dirty Tricks information shaping work in order to isolate them, in order to persecute them. What is the shape, build, hold, clear, shape, clear, hold, build transition? Is that?
Yep.
Yes. So step one in the counterinsurgency blueprint that's effectively doctrine is shaping. You shape the information environment in order to rig the information ecosystem against the insurgent group. So a great example of this was Afghanistan. So we installed, you know, Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan, who ruled over it with an iron fist. His brother was the heroin drug lord of the galactic universe. You know, Afghanistan exported 95% of the world's heroin under the watch of the brother of the US installed president there. The Afghanis looked at all the corruption and destruction of their country and the exploitation of their resources by foreign investors and foreign corporations and said, hey, we live here in Afghanistan. Now, listen, I'm not trying to whitewash the evil deeds of the Taliban. I'm just trying to, I probably could have picked a better example. Okay?
No,
Admittedly.
That's a much longer conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you do initially there is you wedge that. So, you know, the first step is shaping, and then the second step is the nasty part. It's called clear. That is when you clear them out, you purge them, you do nasty things to that group in order to lock them up. You sic the Justice Department or law enforcement against them. But before you clear them, you shape the information environment to demonize them and to wedge them against the other coalition members they have so that when they get cleared, nobody is complaining about it, or only a smaller remnant is complaining about it than used to. So the next step in the counterinsurgency linear process is called hold, where you hold against the blowback from the remnant that you could not successfully shape in the first place. And then you build new infrastructure on top of that, and you transition it off to the rule of law rather than the military counterinsurgency. But one of the things that conjoined the domestic censorship industry with the military counterinsurgency group was that concept that I've said multiple times here: whole of society, government, private sector, civil society and NGOs and universities and nonprofits, and media. Those four categories, again, government, private sector, civil society, and media, all working in unison, all fused into the cell of the nucleus of a single cell. That is a counterinsurgency doctrine. That is a counterinsurgency framework. That is part and parcel of that, which is that the State Department will work with the private sector firms who are in the area. They will cut them off of banking services so that the insurgency group can't have bank accounts, or can't do microfinance transactions, or can't access certain goods and services that are necessary for it to carry out its activities. It will work with the humanitarian groups and the NGOs in order to create a sort of atrocity porn that will be published by the media about how nasty this insurgent group, whether it's true or false. And they will tally the human rights violations, and they will use the good credibility of their name as Human Rights Watch, or as Freedom House, or as any one of these, in order to help that information shaping. And then the allied media organizations, whether those are independent ones or whether those are U.S. government-supported media organizations, as our National Endowment for Democracy funds, as USAID funds, as our U.S. Agency for Global Media funds, that media surround sound will transport those narratives that were bought and paid for by the U.S. government. So you have this totalizing, like the walls close in on the insurgency group. They can't buy gas. They can't have a bank account. The media is accusing them of all the crimes. Their friends and family don't want anything to do with them because they don't want their own banking services or their own lives to fall apart. And so they get isolated, so then the clearing process can happen. The other reason is that counterinsurgency was really the first class of creators in this domestic censorship space, is because a lot of this comes back to the fact that Trump was at war with his military brass. And it was that same military consensus that were shared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and that had existed effectively from Truman to Trump about the Wilsonian edict and the role of the military in interventionist conflicts. Trump rode into office not just defeating Hillary Clinton, remember. He defeated Jeb Bush, and in the process called effectively the Bush legacy, which was the only power structure Republicans had in the military, said our involvement in the Iraq War was a big fat mistake. He completely ended the war in Syria. He reversed the military policy in certain key respects around Iran and around Russia. So the military wanted him out. So you had these military specialists in how do you eliminate insurgent political groups abroad, taking their very special set of skills to occupy the Department of Homeland Security in the CISA, Ministry of Truth branch, to occupy these FBI, occupy these State Department GEC positions. I mean, you can even, Clint Watts is a great example of this. Clint Watts was a counterinsurgency guy who was one of the top advisors to DHS. Everyone could go online right now and watch the screenplays that Clint Watts personally was contracted to do for DHS, which were like graphic novel cartoons about disinformation and its threat to democracy. He was a part of the major thought leadership of the orientation of DHS from focusing on Russia to focusing on the United States. Part of this crew, he was at the October 2020 DHS conference where they explicitly said that we need to switch our focus from 80% Russia, 20% domestic disinfo. This is DHS. This is their Countering Foreign Influence Task Forces who said this. We need to switch it from 80% foreign, 20% domestic to 80% domestic, 20% foreign. Their email account still said at Countering Foreign Influence, at like dhs.gov. And they were 80% focused on domestic. And 100% of the repeat misinformation spreaders that their network flagged were all Trump supporters. They defined disinformation as anything that undermines public faith and confidence in the use of mail-in ballots, early voting drop boxes, or electronic voting machines. It was all Trump. It was all Trump people. And so they eliminated these major news organizations from having any virality for 6 months before the 2020 election. They pre-censored them under the barrel of the gun of the DHS, which was midwifed by military counterinsurgency specialists.
So the, excuse me, the skill set that came out of the global war on terror, the network analysis that you see up here, just amplify one other idea, which is in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. The task is to deny, disrupt, degrade, and if possible, destroy. And so when you're dealing with a network that is distributed out, it's very difficult to go after in a traditional military sense. So you have to take out individual nodes, and then if you can, disrupt the system and its system effect by taking out the hub. And what that does is it neutralizes the capacity of whatever that network, be it military or ideational, to effectively operate. Now, I know we need to get on to a question and answer session. I have one last, you've done a terrific job describing the structures level of the iceberg. And I think you've delved down into a little bit into the mental models as to why some of those structures were put into place. I do want to press you a little bit, though. there are real international security risks that Americans need to be aware of. What are those international security risks that you would recognize that we do need some kind of a recognition of institutional support?
Right. So this incoming administration, which has expressed a very strong vision for eliminating these domestic censorship programs, is going to run into two parallel arguments as they're attempted to be eliminated through defunding or through executive orders or through program by program level snipping of them at every agency level. And those are on national security grounds relating to defense work, and on national interest grounds related to our democracy promotion work run out of the State Department. And the intelligence community is sort of a swing player in both of those because it both serves DOD on national security. And so they're going to argue that our diplomatic, defense, and intelligence capacities will be totally crippled if we peel back the censorship capacities that have been massively constructed and fine-tuned after hundreds of millions of dollars of R&D and capacity building over the past 8 years. And the argument they're going to make on national security grounds is that the nature of war has changed, that the proxy war over who gets elected in a particular country is in some respects actually more important than the military war, because the civilian elected government in a democratic country has technical control over the military. They're the commander-in-chief, the military answers to them, and if they're in any EU country, that's the way it works. There's only a handful of exceptions, like Pakistan, that don't fit that civilian-run government outside of China and the pure authoritarian states. And so they're going to argue that U.S. military posture is going to be massively undermined if there is not a capacity to be able to stop pro-Russian or pro-China or pro-Iran or pro-Venezuela. Regionally, this will play out desk by desk. They will argue if you allow this political insurgency group or this group to rise to power, it will massively undermine our military position in the area. Let's just say it's Poland, for example, right? You have a military base that's being constructed there. Well, what if a government is rising to power who's hostile to having the military base there? And also that Polish government that's neck and neck with the U.S.-supported one is running on a plank of cheap Russian gas, and that they are going to circumvent the EU sanctions. They're going to, that every dollar of Russian gas revenue feeds into the Russian military machine. So you're going to have dead boys and girls in the Sahel in Africa, and in our outposts in Iraq that are being backed by Russian proxies or Russian-supported rebel groups. And this is because we allowed this political party in Poland to rise to power when they were known to be a Russian affinity. Even if we don't have them caught with a formal agreement with the Russian Federation, if they're running on something good for Russia and bad for the U.S., we still need a national security capacity to put bumper cars on their capacity to accrue popular will. You're going to see that same thing from and it's going to be hard for a lot of Republicans to look those people in the eye. When that argument is made, you're going to have dead American boys and girls coming home in body bags because of Russian-supported military activity that we could have stopped. They only, these African rebels in Niger were only able to buy those guns because Russian gas, flowed to this political group that we could have stopped. What are you going to say to them when that blood is on your hands? They're going to make that argument. They're also going to make arguments on national interest grounds, and they're going to say, well, we need a tool to stop authoritarian governments. And the new nature of authoritarianism is not the face it had during the Cold War, where you had a communist government that controlled all private sector industry. They have this beautiful new term that does a lot of work. It's called illiberal democracy, which is this concept that we really can't say they're an autocracy. They were democratically elected. We can't even write through fan fiction enough atrocity porn to say they're doing human rights violation. We just had a bunch of key trade agreements with them like 6 months ago. How can we use our regime change toolkit without having to say that they're an autocracy. Okay, well, they are an illiberal democracy. Yeah, you're a democracy. But democratic institutions, don't you know, U.S. State Department and USAID funded and CIA funded assets in the region are not in control of that country's society. And so you have undermined democratic institutions. And so even though you have the popular support of the people, you no longer are in good standing with our definition of democracy, that democratic institutions have to be respected, and they form essentially the local subject matter expertise. And so they're going to argue that on democracy promotion grounds, without this capacity to neutralize or put virality circuit breakers, at least do something about these narratives that are undermining support for USA programming support. Why do we even pay the Kiev Independent in Ukraine? Why does the National Endowment for Democracy even give them the money if they're just going to be railroaded by a bunch of popular social media accounts that discredit them? We need the knob downturning in order to make the most of our knob upturning. And what this fundamentally does is it's a refusal to let the chips fall where they may in terms of certain processes that were respected in this country at some level for 2.5 centuries, but at least on most levels for 80 years, which was this idea that, look, it's enough. It's enough of a dirty trick to turn the propaganda engine up to 11 and create a surround sound of 70 US-funded media organizations so that people in Ukraine are living in a literal Truman Show where every piece of information is coming from this thing that was funded by USAID and this media organization, which they grew up with, is actually funded by Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty. And they're living in a world of narratives that are piped in from a subsea cable from Langley, Virginia. That's enough of a dirty trick as is. But you can argue, well, listen, if other countries or native media in Ukraine has a more compelling narrative, they can capacity build their own institutions. When you go from knob upturning to this new capacity for knob downturning, this goes from saying, listen, it's a fair gunfight to straight up homicide. You are just murdering free speech in these countries. And you are, at a certain point, you have to let chips fall where they may if you believe in democracy in the first place, which is to say that it's supposed to be a civilian-run government. So what the heck is the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus doing preventing civilians from voting for their own government? And so you're going to run into that, which is that at some point there has to be some way in which you say, we're okay not winning this war. We're okay not winning this soft power tete-a-tete with a certain domestic group. We've done as much as we could within the human rights framework of free speech as an international right, as it is, I should remind people, under the UN Declaration on Human Rights since 1948, which forms the basis of us sanctioning Iran when they censor their internet, or sanctioning North Korea when they censor journalists. The diplomatic blowback also, the moment you lose one time, and everybody gets to see the fact that their censorship was not actually something purely domestic about their own government, but was a hostile foreign country, which they will say the US is for having done this. Those countries, 200 years will go by, and those stories of what the US Global Engagement Center did to take over their media is going to be part of the folklore that their children learn. And this sort of long-range thinking about, I mean, if that happened here, if it turned out that the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN and NPR were actually all Russian proxies all along, and that all of the, every time you were censored by, on social media, it was not actually because of, a rogue DHS agency. It was actually because China wanted Biden to win, and there are all these declassified cables about China coercing the Biden administration to censor you. That will be part of the folklore and the veins of American blood as a nationalist font against that country for hundreds of years. But these diplomats aren't in those roles for that period of time. So I don't even think it's in the US long-term interest. I think these are quick wins people get because they see censorship works. But the fact is if you go back to saying what we did in the Cold War is okay, because you see I couldn't reach under the table and turn off the volume to your vocal cords when you were at the kitchen table telling mom and dad that you were going to join a tree huggers movement to oppose the Vietnam War. They can do that now. because of the AI censorship, algorithms and technologies that allow you to do that on the digital side. So that may require a compromise where Trump feels, in order to satiate the sort of Marco Rubio, IRI, NED side of the State Department, maybe he needs to upscale propaganda capacities. You may see that. And it may look a little counterintuitive that some of these agencies are getting more funding to do stuff that looks unseemly, but it's to offset the nasty censorship. So that's going to be a stakeholder conversation that this administration is going to have to take on.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? You've been taking notes vociferously here. So.
Hi. Great to meet you.
So many questions, but a couple that I just wanted to touch on. I haven't heard you, I may have missed you again, I'm sorry, but you didn't touch on modernization in this conversation. I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah.
Sorry. So my name is Juana, and I come from a little bit of a different background than I think most people in this. So I come from the artist's world. I fled New York during the COVID policies and came here, which to a state that I'm very grateful to have been able to come to. My background is my mother is Hungarian, my grandfather were Jews, fled Hitler, then my grandfather was put into a gulag, spent 10 decades, 10 years there, and then died in Pitești prison. So I'm very familiar with this, and I spent a lot of time in Romania under the Soviets.
Yep.
So what I'm seeing here reminds me a lot of certain things that we don't hear discussed often, which I've been looking at one of my texts, which is the foundation of, in 1934, the creation of the purging and censoring machine that was birthed prior to Stalin, but really got into sort of into the blood, then known as Sok realism, which most people think is an aesthetic, but it's not. It's a philosophy. So I hear a lot about that going on, and I also see in this how I often say that we didn't win the Cold War. Mao just beat Stalin, and that what we see going on coming out of, say, the Yemen speech of I think it was 1956.
Question, please.
Yeah, so my question for you, sorry, it's an enthusiastic moment because I never hear anyone discussing it. I want to ask you.
She takes after me.
Yeah.
No, I want to ask you one thing because I've seen you discuss a little bit about the arts before.
Oh, yeah.
What I'd like to know is, has anyone with a connection to Trump's background in media, showmanship, and all of that, pointed out to him how similar this is to what's happened before, and how instead of just being counterinsurgency, it could be called counter-dissidence, and looking into the role that artists like Václav Havel played to defeat an artist like Mao?
Yeah, well, you're singing the song of my people. I mean, the world of art is, wrapped up in this in a lot of ways. I mean, the role of art in statecraft is absolutely enormous. And folks may be familiar with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which got in a lot of hot water in the 1970s when it was revealed that this giant artist enclave, which spanned everything from musicians to poets to entertainers to senior thought leader writers, the whole thing was a giant CIA front, and it existed for the purpose of using the diplomatic influence capacity of the entertainment world and of writers and poets and musicians in order to swing hearts and minds around the world into the sort of U.S.-NATO orbit instead of the Soviet Union, and as well turned at home to stop the wing of the Democrat Party that was deemed to be sort of against the nascent U.S. blob and was more sympathetic to the Soviet Union's narratives about NATO interventionism. And so, but the Congress for Cultural Freedom is just one example of that. I mean, the whole music industry runs through the intelligence and statecraft world in really interesting ways, from jazz diplomacy with the U.S. State Department in the 1940s. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was, this CIA front was hosting classical music conferences all over France and Italy in order to combat the perceived, soft power influence of Shostakovich and Russian classical music composers. Rock music was exported to Germany to have rock music concerts at the Berlin Wall in the entire. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm not. But what? Well. Well, I bring this up in part because Tony Blinken actually created, for the first time ever, at the U.S. State Department just 2 years ago, a U.S. State Department Bureau for Music Diplomacy, which is a formal State Department program to diplomatically back-channel with performing artists and musicians from all over the world. This happened in tandem with, by the way, with the U.S. Pentagon becoming the largest financial sponsor of South by Southwest, the major, the largest indie music conference in the U.S. is now a military operation, effectively. Dua Lipa, the popular Albanian pop musician who's a multi-time Grammy chart topper and from Kosovo, she was given a Distinguished Leadership Award from the Atlantic Council last year. There was 7 CIA directors on the board and annual funding from the Pentagon and the State Department, and they're giving Dua Lipa a Distinguished Leadership Award as a pop musician. Well, it's because as part of her sort of public messaging, it's to support essentially enforcement of human rights violations against the current government in Serbia, who's got tensions with NATO. And so NATO is awarding popular musicians to promote to the people that we need effectively, a sort of lawfare campaign against government adversaries of NATO. And so this is sort of a tale as old as time, but this is also part of this censorship apparatus when you have these activists and NGOs and people who go way beyond the technical confines of the State Department in using their voice to support censorship policies. Like in Brazil, they got high-level academics who are known in the country and respected. They're at white shoe universities, and suddenly they become founding members of a new National Endowment for Democracy CIA front group for combating misinformation in Brazil, and they are now doing national tours to the parliament, to the national assemblies, to the prosecutors associations, just vomiting out the CIA front policy on what censorship laws need to be enacted in the country in order to lock up Bolsonaro and all of his supporters on Telegram and WhatsApp and Facebook, and in order to impose sanctions against a U.S. national champion tech company, X. So you have the State Department, who was set up in 1789 in part to promote U.S. national champions, corporate bodies whose profitability improves the livelihood of people in the U.S. homeland. This is the inversion of the national champion doctrine. The State Department is paying people in foreign countries to kill domestic national champions because they allow the proliferation of speech that is the political generator of both the Bolsonaro movement in Brazil and the Trump movement in the U.S.
We have a hand over here, down on the front. Keep going, a little bit further. Yep, you, sir.
Oh, thank you. I, too, am an appreciator of free speech on the internet. I guess to give the devil his due, do you have any concerns about bot farms and AI being used almost to turn up the volume on social media to almost drown out regular expressions or ideas and almost create sort of a dead internet, as some would say?
Right. Are you Colin by any chance?
Yes,
I was about to read your question. Yeah.
No, to the extent that happens, I don't think that is an infringement on free speech, because that's not political speech. That's, there existed before the 2016 advent of the censorship industry. There had existed all terms of service violations for inauthentic activity, because these bot farms did not start with political work. I mean, corporations were using that to boost the Instagram shares and retweets on Burger King rollouts and things like that. I mean, everybody had a vested interest in that sort of inauthentic activity, just like spam, child porn, bot farming, and all that stuff is, that's not tipping a political or a cultural exchange of ideas, in order to rig it that way. The problem is if you lean on that too hard, you're actually going to get pushback from the people that you think you're making a concession to, which is the U.S. Pentagon, for example. I mean, everyone can read. Wired magazine, for example, did a whole thing on how the Pentagon is using bot farms to do the same thing to promote social media activity as was alleged to have been done, for example, in the Arab Spring in order to help astroturf some of those movements. Ironically enough, for all the talk about Russian bots and trolls in the 2016 election, that is not a good data point for making that case, because the Justice Department launched an indictment against the 12 members of the Internet Research Agency, but then dropped the case as soon as 2 of them filed motions for discovery and said, oh, actually, we're going to let you get away with those Russian bots and troll farms, because if we have to tell you how we know you're Russian bots and troll farms, it will undermine national security. So, and then...
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah.
One of the things that there's, going back down to the mental models of the iceberg, and a lot of what the conversation we've had over the last hour and a half is control. There is a deep desire to control what we are exposed to. And a lot of that comes down to partly the military mindset, the securitization mindset, the we have to eliminate the risk mindset. This has to be raised to an explicit level of conversation. We have to at least have a conversation about, are there risks that we must now accept with a digital world? If we are unwilling to accept those risks as Americans, how do we sociologically respond? Do we put down our iPads? Do we put down our cell phones? Do we think about how we can live our lives without those instruments? This is one thing I would really, really ask our civilization to consider, because the alternative of having the most elegant man-hunting organization, set of capabilities ever devised, where we actually provide the data to find us and manipulate our minds through behavioral economics, this is what we are doing to ourselves sociologically. This superficial conversation about structure is a Band-Aid on what we have allowed ourselves to become susceptible to sociologically. So might we think about how we organize ourselves to live life such that we are not dependent on the things that create the vulnerability? Open for discussion, but we have just time for one more question. You've all been extremely patient. Sir, you had your hand up first, so.
Hi. With the the old adage, people are personnel or policy, is this a question of, if you were the mayor of New York City, you want to stop the crime? Well, the cops know there's 700 thugs in New York City that are doing 90% of the crime. Do we have 3,000 people in the State Department, CIA, Pentagon, and the whole federal government? I mean, is there a number of people that we can fire and end this bleeding? Or is it so deep that it's not, there's no hope?
I would say there's no hope. Cheer up. We got a good thing going right now. It's going to take a lot longer, and it's going to require the expenditure of a lot more political capital than you would otherwise think. In terms of whether or not there are 3,000 people who can be laid off, this is a now existential question that's hanging over the Trump administration about whether or not they will pursue the Schedule F tactic that folks may have heard about. Basically, this sort of administrative state lever that can be pulled to do the kind of mass layoffs of the bureaucracy that circumvent the typical process red flags that are thrown in the process to keep careers as careers. Because in the State Department, the political appointees are vastly, vastly, vastly outnumbered by the Foreign Service and so the career folks. I mean, most people in the State Department are not appointed by the president. The president only gets about 5,000 political appointees across every government agency. And so it's, in some agencies, that's like a dozen or a couple dozen or a couple hundred at most. And those are all siloed off in different bureaus, whether that's the Economic Bureau or whether that's in the Stabilization Bureau or whether that's in sanctions. So you have you have this issue, which is that careers have a sort of funny fidelity to their name, which is that they're there for their whole careers. They are appointed by they come into office under a certain president, and then they stay through the political transition of different parties. So, a career that starts under Clinton is going to still be at state under Bush, still be at state under Obama, still be at state under Trump, still be at state under Biden, and now they're back again. Trump only had 4 years in office, which is not a lot of time to get careers in. The careers that are sort of come from the populist Trump camp are still outnumbered 100 to 1 by all the others. And that process of marching through the institutions through careers is a long process, and it's a dilutive process to the extent that J.D. Vance or whoever does not win in 2028. This is constantly in motion, and careers have a lot of power, a lot of tricks, a lot of ways to throw monkey wrenches in what the politicals they're supposed to answer to do. I can tell you, you get a day one orientation at the State Department telling you as a career that you don't really run this place. Thanks for visiting. Hope you enjoy the free coffee. But this is, these are all the bureaucratic processes that protect us. These are, this is the process for these things. You can't fire us. Even if you try to transfer us to the Siberia office, it's going to take 2 years, and you might not even be here because of all these other tripwires that you might get in trouble on various grounds for doing. And so you do need a coalition in there in order to implement that policy. And sometimes that coalition is simply a factor of how many stacking politicals can occupy a particular bureau to be able to dominate that office and actually do what the people voted for there and resist the bureaucracy. So I don't know if the Trump administration is going to execute Schedule F. The whole Project 2025 kerfuffle was pretty much all about Schedule F, and then they folded in a sort of tail-end political, sell point around abortion and around, the women's rights or some of the more, third-rail elements of Project 2025 aesthetics. But the linchpin, the thing they wanted to make sure it was politically dead on arrival about was Schedule F, the mass firing of the bureaucracy. So if they want to get this done, they need to remove intransigence and populate it with people who are going to carry out the president's agenda. But both of those things are going to cost political capital. John Thune is the head of the Senate, is the Senate Majority Leader. Susan Collins is the Senate Appropriations Committee leader. If Trump wants a budget done, he's going to need to do favors to the GOP side of the blob. They are going to want Liz Cheney picks in there. They are going to want, Bush family and Cheney family folks in there. And so it's going to come down to how much of this political momentum they have that can actually be converted into kinetic energy, so to speak, at each agency level.
So at the end, if you'll recall, I said we're going to vote again. If you are so inclined, I did want to offer at least a parting thought, which is what are the consequences if we do lose the ability to speak openly and clearly on the modern media environment. So please do take a look. It is all about our ability to maintain our integrity, mental, cognitive integrity. This is what the stakes are in the end. So please, vote one more time. But while you're doing that, I want to thank Mike for generously offering his time for his insights.
Thank you to David.
I found fascinating learning what I experienced from the inside and at a very different level that you were operating at that brings so much context to what I experienced personally. If you are interested out in the X world in continuing this kind of conversation, if you are really interested in learning about the morals and ethics of a Western civilization and what free speech means to it, I encourage you to look at New College of Florida, where we, as faculty, encourage this kind of debate and dialogue. And thanks to the Markovitzes and the Socratic stage, we are able to bring such wonderful guests. Thank you very much.